is Wayne. I'm a web developer. Today I'm going to show you my demo that creates a team member web page. As a web developer, I freelance with different companies and my coworkers are changing all the times. They're from different countries. Some of the coworkers I feel like I work very well with and I would like to network with them after my contract is done with a company. So I would like to be able to easily create a um, team member web page or portfolio um, whenever I know about my coworkers. So I have their emails and their GitHubs, easy for me to access. It's saved somewhere. I can always refer back to it. Um, for this to work, I use a Node.js script I created. So I just run it in the terminal, answer some questions. It will start generating different roles, like a manager, engineer, or intern based on how you answer it, and the names you put in, the email or the office number if it's a manager, email GitHub if it's engineer, email and the school they went to, that they have contract with the company with, if they're an intern. These are employee IDs. It's just to keep it scalable in case you want to um, further contribute to my tool and make it into an enterprise solution. Then you have things such as um, employee ID and other properties you can add on to. So first part of this video, I'm going to show you how my tool works, the tests that it passes. I'm using Jest testing framework and the web page it generates. This is already a generated web page. I'm going to erase it very soon. And the second part of the video, I'm going to show you how my code works so you can look at my thinking process in developing a tool like this. And it can also serve as a tutorial for people who would like to create something like this. All right, so to begin, you could go to my Git repository link, which I'm gonna post below on this YouTube video or whichever platform I choose to put this video on. You go on here, you can clone my repository, and pretty much you have an index.js file, package.json, and the library files are important. And the load file, that is, or the load folder, that is what loads this web page. And inside the load folder, you have the data.json. That's actually what's generated after you answer the questions on my Node.js script. So without further ado, let's begin. Let's just say I downloaded all these files here. I list the files and you can see there's an index.js. That's the one you're going to be running. So if you node index.js and you start answering questions. This is what's going to be generated. So before I start answering those questions, I'm going to make sure that that folder load is going to be blank by clearing the data.json. Be careful not to be careful, there's a mock folder that has data.json and there's the actual data.json. So when I refresh it, it is blank. It only has my team and it has no team members. Perfect. Now going back to the node.js script file, I can start answering these questions. I can add a manager, and just going by the previous sample, I'm going to try to output something similar to that. I'm going to answer Mark Zuckerberg, employee ID number 1. He'll be the first employee ID. He's the manager. His email will be markz@gmail.com. Manager office number, let's just say he's on the 3rd floor. Managers, we're going to ask about the office number, 301. We're going to add an engineer. Let's just say I got hired. My employee ID is number 2. This is a small company he started. my email address would be, this is not my actual email address. Let me type in my actual email address. Right? And my username, this is my actual username on GitHub. So as an engineer, you'll be asked for your GitHub link. It's assuming all engineers have a GitHub account. Nowadays, you should have one of your engineer to portfolio what you can do and your contributions to the open source community. You can add an intern. Name of the intern, let's call it Grasshopper. It's a learner. It's trying to learn. Employee ID is number 3. It's the third employee. Email address could be grasshopper@gmail.com. School could be University of Coding. Again, it's an intern, so it's usually a school or university that's contracting with the company. Press enter. You can add more team members with different roles. You can have multiple managers, more engineers, more interns. But when you're done, you can go here, build team web page, and press enter, and it'll show you the JSON that's gonna get created in the terminal. And as you can see on the visual code that I just erased, it writes into data.json, and this web page load will be loading from that data.json. I chose not to write to a HTML file. I chose to write to a JSON file. I feel that that's much more neater to because data information usually is in some sort of data format like JSON or JSON file or database. It's just like to keep things clean and separated. Now, if I refresh the page, you'll see what I entered. The first employee, number 1, is Mark Zuckerberg with the email and the office number. The second employee, Wayne, is the engineer with my GitHub link and my email. The third employee is an intern contracted with University of Coding, and here's his email. So it works perfectly fine. Once you build a team page, it will remind you to open load / in the web page. So it's okay if you forget, and it tells you where the data is outputted to load / data.json. Here we also have tests that you can run. To run that, you can be npm test. Technically, you can be npm run test. Test is a script that's in the package.json, but test is one of those scripts that you can shorthand it. npm test is just fine. Run it, and it'll run tests on 4 different classes that my Node.js script relies on to keep the code clean. And they are manager, engineer, intern, employee. 4 total test suites have passed. 7 individual tests have passed. I'll just show you quickly how my tests are implemented, and this would also segue into part 2 of the video where I show you how my code works, to show you my thinking process as a developer, and also act as a sort of tutorial for people who want to create app like this. Not necessarily a team member generator, but some sort of HTML generator using JSON files. So it'll be appropriate for them to watch this as well. If you are just interested in seeing my generator tool generate the web page of team members and my test is passing, then you can end this video here. Alright, to continue to part 2, as you know, this web page is under load / and it refers to data.json that's been outputted by the node script node index.js. Be careful, there is a mock folder. This is not the mock folder that Jest uses. It's a mock folder as in you just copy and paste it to data.json to see that the web page generates fine, because this web page is acting separately from my Node.js script, so it's not involved in the Jest testing. it will make sense in a short moment. Um, when you run index.js and it starts asking you those questions, what kind of employees they are and what kind of roles they play, and the specific information such as their office, GitHub, or school, depending on the role, and the more generic questions, their employee ID and their email address, that's all in index.js. When you first run, it's going to require three classes: inquirer and file system. Yes, file system is what allows you to write to files. Inquirer is the command line interface uh, um, that's asking you these questions: manager, engineer, intern. Now I'm running it, but I'm not scared it's going to overwrite my output on the web page, because remember, you have to press enter on build team web page before it overwrites data.json or the web page you see. When it asks manager, engineer, intern, it's calling the npm package inquirer. It's a very sweet package that's helpful. Um, when you first passing the questions, in this case, it would be just one question about what role you want to choose, and it's a list, or if you want to build a team web page. And then after the user answers that, then it'll handles those um, responses the user enter. In this case, it would be which one they chose. So you have a choices here, right? And you have a role. The role is the variable that has the user input: manager, engineer, intern, or build team web page. So when you're handling it, after you ask the question, well, inquirer, it prompts and then it changes to a callback in then, and then you can catch any errors by changing to a catch method. After the prompt method is done, after it's done asking you a question, it goes to then method. Then in here, you're going to be doing a switch statement to check for the input the user enter, which is row. If you refer back to the prompt, the name of the variable is row, so that's what you're looking into. So when you're doing a switch, it checks if what the user chose. If you chose the manager, then it's going to start asking questions under the manager class, and you can start asking questions under the engineer class or the intern class. As you can see here, if I choose manager, it's going to start asking what's your name, Mark Zuckerberg, employee ID 1, intern employee's email address, markz@gmail.com, and the office number, so say he's on the third floor. All this logic of questions, they belong under the library folder or lib. You have engineer, intern, manager. So you can imagine inside here, you're also going to have inquirer, except you don't see it here. The reason why you don't see it here using inquirer is because all engineer, intern, and manager, they're inheriting from a base class called employee. For organizational purposes, it doesn't make sense for you to have inquirer in every single class when you can just have it in one file and then inherit it in the engineer, intern, and manager classes. So object-oriented programming is very useful. Keeps your logic clean and it keeps the code clean. As you can imagine, engineer, intern, and manager, they're different employee roles. So they're going to extend from the employee class. All right. In the employee class, you have the very generic question with the person's name, employee ID, and email address. Every single row here asks that. It doesn't matter which row you pick. But what they have that's different from each other is the very last question. The very last question, depending on your role, it'll ask different questions. You know, so for that to work, you have to override one of the questions. These questions is an array of question objects. Remember in Inker, and we're going to have a method that asks questions for any of the engineer, intern, or manager. It's going to use Inker, and it's going to pass the array of question objects. After that, it's going to set the values for that class. For example, after you answer the person's name, if it's under engineer, it's going to save the name under the engineer class. If it's an intern, notice where my mouse is, it's going to save the name under intern because it's inherited, right? So for ask questions in the Inker, once you answer those questions, it's going to set the properties for that class. Instead of going answers.email equals, assigning the property directly, I use a set method. This is a convention in object-oriented programming where you're getting a value or you're setting a value. You don't get the value directly from the class. You're using a method that returns or sets the value that you pass to it. This is a good convention that a lot of object-oriented programming uses. Yeah, so that's that. Going back to the main script file, as you can see, you're calling the manager. So the manager inherits from the employee, and then you ask questions. The ask question is a method that's inherited from the employee method. So you'll ask these individual questions. And then the last question you may ask, how does it know the last question? Well, for every single employee row, when you create a new employee or you create a new intern or you create a new manager, depending on the switch case, depending on what the user chooses as a row, it's going to call the constructor on that class engineer, for example, and it extends employee, but it's going to have a reference to the base class, and it's going to set the row or set, it's a variable that belongs to that class, and it's going to override the last question. Enter GitHub username. All engineers will be asked for the GitHub username. If you go back to the employee class, notice that the last question says overriding failed. So this is supposed to be overridden, So that's why in my tests is for engineer, intern, and manager, one of my tests is test if the final question was overridden. It does that by checking, for example, under the engineer.test.js. This is a convention that Jest testing framework uses. Whichever JS file you're using, it adds the test.js at the end. That's the file name that you need under the underscore test underscore, because that's what Jest looks at when you're running the Jest script from package.json. Going back to that, you're checking if the question contains the string GitHub. If it does, it's overridden, which is good because now you're not going to be asking, you're not going to be showing this error overriding failed. Instead, under engineering, you're going to ask enter the GitHub username. So that's the reason for that test. There are other tests because you have to create the engineer object. Remember, going back to index.js, depending on what the user chose for the Inker prompts, it's going to create a new object that's a manager, engineer, or intern, and then you can start asking questions from that class. When you create the object, a few things happen. So say going back to engineer, it was gonna set the role engineer so that when you output to the JSON file and you open the web page for this particular employee that we did, it's gonna know what icon to pull off, and it's gonna know that it's gonna be labeled manager versus engineer with the glasses or intern with the graduate icon. So that forms the basis of all the other tests in intern and manager. Remember, manager is going to have to test if there's an office string. Intern is going to test if there's a school string. Engineer tests if there's a GitHub string. So if you go through each one individually, office, school, and engineer. When you're creating the object, it's gonna check if what you created inside the class. I'm going to call the constructor as if I'm inside index.js when you are in that particular case in the switch statement. And I'm gonna test if that is a object of a class engineer. So that's why you go expect engineer to equal expect any engineer. Any can be string, number, or whatever. If it's number, when you're expecting tree, actually tree is constructed from a number class. So that will work as well. But in this case, we created an object or instantialized an object engineer from the class engineer. And we also want to check when we do get row, following the convention of get and set methods, if it has the label engineer. So that the web page is going to have the label engineer. So that forms the basis of that test. The employee test itself is a lot easier because it doesn't have all that overriding going on. The other test is I had to test for overriding, and then if the test failed, I set it up so it failed initially. Then I write the code so the test will pass, and then I refactor the code. I did a TDD method to create these classes, or test-driven development methodology. That's why I have all these tests here. So go into package.json. You can see that my testing framework is again Jest. That's why when I run npm run test or npm test, it will call Jest. Jest will look into the double underscore test double underscore folder for these files, and run those tests that you saw earlier in part 1. You can ignore live reload dot. Live reload is a npm package that allows me to do live reloading, hot reloading, or however you call it. The web page changes as I design the code. That's in the very beginning phase of my coding when I was trying to figure out the CSS to make this layout. Live reload you don't need it in production. In Jest you don't need it in production, so it's under def dependencies. What you need under dependencies is inker, because you're going to be asking the users these questions. For these command line user face prompts, you're going to need the npm package inker. So with that done, I show you how the node script works. I show you how the test files work. I'm going to show you how the web page works. Again, I'm going to have to end this tutorial as fast as possible. Looks like my mouse is going to run out of batteries. You have a load folder. Ignore the mock folder. That's something I created manually, so I can test the layout. There's a data.json file that's created from the Node.js script file, and there's an index.html. Our CSS and JavaScript are in this one page to make things easier, so you can just copy and paste this. Well, not copy and paste, well you could, but you can just download or copy this folder and then make sure it's in the same folder as team members generator, or you can just clone the repository. Anyhow, it will override data.json. Then you can move this folder load outside of the the Git folder. I'll show you an example very quickly. See the load folder? I'm gonna move it outside here, and I'm gonna call it test. So test. And this layout still loads. This proves that it's independent of the Node.js script. So you can copy as many instances of that folder as possible. So you can have different team members for different companies. You have different folders and you can refer to those team members depending on which folder you open. But I'm going to show you quickly how the layout works. First, I'm going to have to move it back in. So I can easily refer to it in my Visual Code. Going back to index.html file, you have these classes that help me design the web page. You have materialized CSS. That's the bulk of all these designs and components. And we have these different individual icons depending on your role. So if you're a manager, your icon's gonna be looking different compared to engineer or intern. You also have different labels in the CSS. If you're a manager, it's gonna be different from when you're an engineer and intern. Each individual card, as they call it, material CSS, there we go. I have a card inside a card. So my team is a big card, and you have smaller cards inside. These are the employees. So you can see there's a engineer class and there's an intern class. There's a manager class. So through hierarchy in CSS, that dictates the icon and the label. For the name, the ID, the email, office number, or the GitHub username or the school name, that's all from data.json. How that's working is I use jQuery. You can easily use JavaScript. You don't have to use jQuery. I use jQuery for this purpose because it's a lot easier, well, not easier, a lot faster to type. So it lowers development time. The sacrifice is that it loads slower. So you can always refactor it to vanilla JavaScript. How this works is it looks into data.json and make sure there's no caching, because if you're going to be generating different teams, your web browser might be showing older teams if you don't turn off caching. So I make sure to turn that off. I pass it a callback. Inside this callback, it plugs out the team members from data.json. Perfect. This is why I have the mock file for data.json. If it's outputted from node.js, it's not prettified. And the mock file is prettified. You can see the lining, the spacing, so it's easy to see the relationships between the different employee role objects. This whole object is one employee, another. Remember, this is the mock code, so we never use a full board employee. We use a grasshopper employee in the actual output, but it's close enough. We can use this. There's a team members array inside data.json. Each one has the object that represents the employee that you answered. Again, there can be more than 3 employees. There can be less than 3 employees. Depends on how you answer the questions on the Node.js script. It reads through that file and it goes through the team members array. For each team member object or employee object, it's going to clone a template. And inside a template, it starts filling the name. It fills in it adds in the class. Remember, I show you that there's a class of engineer, a class of manager, a class of intern, and that dictates the icon and the role label, and then you fill in the ID and email. And then depending on the role, or as you can say, the class name before you render it, it's going to format the third item here differently. That makes perfect sense. A manager is going to just have the office number, engineer, however, you need to create a link to the GitHub profile, and that would be consist of me inspected github.com/username, which is what you see here. This is a template literal. Instead of using concatenation, string plus string, you can use it in this format. And intern simply is the school name. Now you may ask, where did the school GitHub or office labels come from? Well, it's the same thing as I did for the row labels. It's all CSS. So you can see here, GitHub school office. I also have the labels ID and email, which is generic to all employees. I have that in the CSS. So after the template is filled in, then I append it to the team members, which is this entire card called My Team. I'm going to show you the template very fast. The template is a template block. You have your own HTML here that gets filled in using DOM manipulation. If you're using vanilla JavaScript, it will be query selector. If you're using jQuery, it would be this kind of format with the $ symbol, and then you pass it the query. Yep, so that concludes part 1, which is a demonstration of my tool generating the team portfolio, as well as passing of the tests, which passes each individual class, manager, engineer, intern, and its base class, employee. And I show you part 2, which is how the Node.js script index.js works, how it refers to these classes under the library folder. I show you the rationale for the tests using the Jest framework, and I show you package.json, the anchor that you uses to ask you questions on a Node.js prompt. I show you Jest, how it's included in the package.json under developer dependencies. Live reload, I did a quick mention. It's not really necessary. It helped me design the team portfolio much more quicker. Speaking of that, I show you how the HTML works, how the Node.js script actually writes to data.json, and then I show you index.html, how it has its own CSS, how it uses materialized CSS framework to design this team portfolio that you see, how it uses jQuery, or you can use vanilla JavaScript to get the contents of data.json that was outputted and refer to a template code for each individual employee, and then appends it to the My Team card. This concludes this demonstration. I hope you learned a lot, or if this is interesting or helpful, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. That will help me a lot. This is Wing Fei Feng. I'll see you next time.